Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast, Digitally Transformed. It's your host, Melissa, and today we have guest Phil Magnuszewski with me. He's the Chief Innovation Officer here at Infused Innovations, and I'm always so excited to have him here on the podcast. He's so excited about all things technology and innovation. How are you today, Phil?
I'm great, Melissa. Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, of course. So today we're talking about something very important. Technology is continuing to advance, and we are seeing that artificial intelligence is being used in so much of the technology that we use every day in our personal and business lives. So today we're going to talk about responsible AI. But before we get into that, can you tell us what exactly artificial intelligence is?
Yeah, sure. And by purest definition, artificial intelligence, or AI as we collectively call it in an abbreviated fashion, is intelligence demonstrated by machines as opposed to humans or animals. But in layman's terms, really think of it as the simulation of human intelligence. One of the things that's important to note about it is that there are really kind of two disciplines that kind of fall underneath artificial intelligence, and one is called narrow AI and general AI. And what I mean by that is narrow AI is artificial intelligence that's programmed to perform a specific task. So it doesn't have to be just like one task, right? But it's, let's say we've all seen the videos of a computer that's been trained to play chess, for example, right? So that's an example of narrow AI. General AI, which is mostly science fiction at this point, is when artificial intelligence is now able to think and program itself. If you want to look at an extreme example from the sci-fi genre, you can think of the old movie Terminator, right, and Skynet. When people think of AI and general AI and what it is, I think that's kind of one of the first things that pops into people's minds and
Oh, yeah.
creates some fear. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But most of the examples of artificial intelligence are really, again, more aligned to the narrow AI kind of thing, designed to perform a specific task. Examples that we see every day, the use of and development of autonomous cars, chatbots. So if you go on a website and you're engaging on a website with, the little chat functionality, some organizations are using chatbots for that. And then in healthcare space, they're using they're training AI to review x-rays, PET scans, those kind of things that can be done. Again, a very specific kind of task.
Okay, that distinction actually really helps me identify and understand, and I'm sure everyone else. Narrow AI is a lot of the business intelligence tools that we're using, where general AI, as you said, is, when we think of the media or those news
Mhm.
outlets that would share like the Transformers big
Yeah.
destructive machines. And there's obviously this negative connotation that's been attached to artificial intelligence. So talk to us about those big concerns that people have about AI becoming such a large part of our everyday lives and why.
Yeah, and I think some of them, it's part of our history as humans, right? When fire first came out, I'm sure there was fear around that. Electricity, any kind of significant advancement in technology, and I use that term, in kind of air quotes. There's always some fear, some uncertainty that brings along with it as well. And this isn't any different. The thing with AI is that we already see how quickly it's being deployed, and we can quickly start to see where and how pervasive that's going to be in
Mm.
our lives. It's going to touch almost everything we do, and it's going to be around us for a long, long time. And that's a bit scary to have something this big,
And
that's this
powerful.
pervasive and powerful, right? And we're going to become very reliant on it. It does cause tech anxiety. And like I mentioned, it's not just the little fringe components of our lives, but the really big things like healthcare, right? Finances, personal safety. You can see how it's starting to get into each of those areas and beyond. And yeah, without the proper guardrails, there are some concerns, rightfully so, in terms of how quickly that rolls out and what impact that's going to have on us.
Yeah, well, you mentioned guardrails, which makes me really think about, to me, what the big question is here, which is rules and regulations, which is something that I think is going to be massively important when it comes to artificial intelligence. But let's talk about responsible AI, because this is something that we've been hearing a lot in the technology industry. How How can AI even be responsible? What does this term even mean?
That's a great question, and just to kind of put some structure around it. So, responsible AI is really the government's framework that
Mhm.
documents how a specific organization is going to address the challenges around artificial intelligence. And I'm talking about from both the legal, which you mentioned, but
Mhm.
also the ethical side of it, right? And it's important to understand both pieces of that, right? Because the ethical component, I think we are able to address that to some extent in real time and understand that, whereas the legal side of this is behind kind of from a timeline perspective, right? I'll give you an example. So we've seen this in the news probably over the past couple of years, the whole concept of using and collecting video data, right? Facial recognition in public places. The laws haven't kept suit with how quickly the technology is advancing and where it's being used. So the whole concept of my data, my personal privacy, if I'm collecting data and image recognition and facial recognition in public places, what rights do I have as an individual at that point,
Right.
right? And how is that going to be used?
And there's no consent in that.
There's no consent. Correct. It's not just legal issues, but the ethical issues that it comes down to right versus wrong as part of this as well.
And in that example, that information can be used against certain groups. It can be used to manipulate certain
Hmm.
agendas. I can see how that can go haywire. So that's kind of like the basic idea of what responsible AI is. But like I really want to talk about a larger context of why this really matters. I mean, can you go a little bit deeper into some consequences if
Yeah.
we're not really
Yeah.
monitoring AI?
For sure, for sure. And I think one of the concepts just to kind of bring to light here is the concept of how these artificial intelligence engines kind of work, right? They're built on algorithms, right? And algorithms are essentially just kind of process or set of rules that follow specific calculations, but they're built on something, right? And they're used in different ways. Let's take, for example, if you were building and looking at trying to evaluate people for credit risk, right? So you would build an algorithm that takes into effect, income and age and maybe how long you live somewhere. And the question then becomes what questions can and should be asked? Do you take a look at ethnicity or education or other things like that? And the problem and the challenge sometimes with these algorithms that are used in these specific scenarios is that they're kind of to some extent a black box. Like we don't always see how those algorithms are being built, what factors and things and pieces of data are being pulled into it, and how it's being calculated.
Right.
Algorithms have to be trained, right? So you build the algorithms, you teach it, you train it, you test it, you validate it. But if bad data gets in there, or if someone tweaks the algorithm in a way that doesn't necessarily make it fair for a particular segment of the population, for example, like for loan approvals, then that's an example where those things can kind of go bad, and why it's very important to understand how the algorithms are being built, how they're being applied, and really kind of thinking through the entire process with that.
Yeah, I mean, we see this all the time. Numbers get taken out of context when there's no human behind it.
Yeah.
Even, on our end with marketing, sometimes you'll see an inflated number or a decreased number and you could freak out, but then it's like, oh, well, there's actually some context around that.
Yeah.
And so numbers, sometimes they don't tell you everything that's happening. We're talking about responsible AI, but what are the values? What encompasses responsible AI?
Yeah, there are a number of different frameworks out there. We kind of subscribe to one of the frameworks where there are kind of six key values that we kind of look at. And before we engage in any kind of AI project here, we kind of think through these both internally as an organization. And is this a project that we know is going to check all the right boxes in these values that I'm going to go through in just a second. And then we'll also advise clients on making sure that they're taking these things into consideration before they kick off any kind of project like this. But
Right.
we're looking for things like, one of the values is fairness, right? An idea that the AI system should treat all people fairly, regardless of background, ethnicity, income levels, those kind of things as well. Second one is around reliability and safety, and that the AI systems themselves should be able to perform reliably and safely. Privacy and security is a big thing, making sure that those concepts are kept in the forefront, and that we're respecting the privacy of individuals and or organizations. Inclusiveness, AI systems should empower everyone to engage within it in an equal manner. Transparency, meaning that the AI systems should be understandable, and going back to the algorithms, making sure that there is some kind of audit process that's happening around the algorithms themselves. And then, the concept of accountability. People should be accountable for the AI systems and how they're being applied as well. So, we kind of use those as the guideposts, but again, both internally and with our clients, just to kind of make sure that as we're embarking, because this is such a new area. I mean, some of the use cases are fairly simple, but some can get fairly complicated pretty quickly. So we like to use that as kind of the guidepost as we're engaging and working with clients in this area.
Yeah, that's a great list. Thanks for going through all of that. Can you give us some real life examples so that we can kind of put that to real life and understand how, if not practiced ethically, AI could be of a disservice or harmful to society? Or, tell us what could happen if businesses are not practicing AI responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about the loan approval thing before, and that's probably a good one. In fact, there are actually some laws in place now that address that. So those are things, that's, I think, one area where, even though it can be improved, there is some foundational legal requirements around that. But, think about like benefit payments, whether it's life insurance or healthcare, right? Thinking about and thinking through steps that should be taken to ensure that AI doesn't inadvertently uncover, PII or personally identifiable information as part of the process. Understanding what data feeds are being pulled in are important to that. Anonymity, making sure that, again, we're looking at fairness and equality and all those things that we talked about before in terms of what the the key principles are, making sure those are in place. I mean, think about, for example, if not this isn't meant to be putting a bad light on healthcare providers or health insurance companies or things like that, but if PII was uncovered that would previously wasn't available, and it would impact the amount of reimbursement a healthcare provider might provide against a surgical procedure or some kind of healthcare crisis that an individual was going through. Those are things that you're trying to. Those are some of the things that you're trying to avoid and making sure that the algorithms are acting in a fair and consistent manner.
Do you think that organizations are responsible for the technology that they produce and to make sure that it's of the benefit to the people or the society and our way of living, sort of similar to what you're talking about right now, having that positive outcome as opposed to maybe stripping away or taking away from someone or an organization?
Yeah, so I initially, when I was first thinking about this, I kind of go back and forth, and my visceral response is yes, they're obviously responsible, but it's gray. I mean, there's a lot of gray pieces to it. I mean, if you look at other areas, you could see a car, for example, right? Manufacturers, you manufacture a car, but a car can be used for good. You take an ambulance, it's transporting someone who needs to go to the hospital, but there are people who, get in car accidents or drunk drivers, and it becomes a weapon, right? It's weaponized. So part of it is not so much the technology, but how it's applied, right? I think that's where the real focus needs to be. It's not that the technology itself is inherently good or bad. It's how it's being used. So the people that are creating the algorithms, the people that are identifying and exploring the use cases, I think they have 100% have ownership and responsibility for the outcomes of what happens with that.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to that value of transparency because I think as I'm thinking through this, an organization that builds, let's say, a technology, people who are consuming or using that technology need to understand how much trust or faith they should have in it, right?
Mhm.
Like, let's say we're talking about like a self-driving car, right?
Yeah.
That's considered AI. How much faith or trust should you or could you have in that? And then I think that's kind of where the argument stands is for who's to responsible for that technology or the outcome of something negative happening from it.
Yeah, I think you're going to see almost a stepped approach to this. I mean, it's going to grow exponentially, but what I think is in certain use cases and areas, you're going to see a quick, exploration of what the technology can do. And I think, and hopefully, I think this is the right approach, is that you're going to see kind of a slowdown, understanding the ramifications or the implications of what's happening, maybe putting some legal components around there if that needs to be part of it too. But I think it's going to be a quick let's try this here, let's see what happens, and then we're going to have to, as a society, not just individuals as or organizations, but as a society, to say, look, these are the responsible AI principles that are important to us. And when this type of technology is used in this particular use case, we need to have these considerations take place and maybe put some stronger, whether they're legal or ethical guidelines around those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, another question, a follow-up question to that is, do you think that that's going to happen anytime soon? Do you think that there will be universal guidelines to really powerful tools like this?
Yeah, universal's probably too strong of a word. I think you're going to see people push back or organizations take accountability for some of these things. Like I mentioned, I gave you the facial recognition example earlier. That's been pushed back on. Citizens in I want to say it's up in Seattle, I think, was one of the first, I don't see lawsuits, but one of the first questions about whether that was legal to do that or not. So you will see that. You're already starting to see that. And I think when people are aware of where and when it's being used, I think that's part of it too, is that some of this stuff happens in the background. You don't really see it.
Right.
So it's not until it has maybe an adverse effect on a group or a set of individuals that you'll see that. But the other thing I'll point out too is that not every country in the world plays by the same rules, whether that's Russia or China or the US. I mean, US, Canada. I mean, there isn't a universal or global set of standards around this stuff, and I don't know that you'll ever will have that, quite frankly. But I guess we'll see over the course of time.
Yeah, well, it is interesting, the point that you brought up. I do think a lot of the AI technologies are either implemented in business intelligence workflows, or it's consumer goods that people are buying, right? And when you're buying something, then you're saying, yes, I agree to this. I want this. Like, for instance, the Alexa in my home, right? Like, I bought that and that's in my home. So I've agreed to that. But I agree that once it becomes a public concern or public issue, something that's so pervasive that it's being used against and on everyone, that's kind of when the public outcry starts to happen. And, that's when things start to change.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Very fascinating conversation. I do want to end this off by asking you, Phil, what is your favorite AI technology that currently exists? And then I also want to know, what technology are you most looking forward to that is underdeveloped or in the making? And there are no walls. I mean, seriously, whatever it is that you're excited about, if it's a flying car, then it's a flying car, you name it.
I am, I recently I'm in the middle of reading a book now that's talking about how close we are to having flying cars. I don't think people realize that probably by the end of this decade, we may see at least the piloting of those things. And that will be cool. And that kind of, goes back to the whole autonomous vehicle conversation, because it wouldn't necessarily just be someone who's driving it.
Well,
a person
certainly
driving
not
it.
all qualified to be
Exactly.
aircraftsmen, yes.
Right. Exactly right. But the one that, and it's maybe more near term for me, that I still find absolutely fascinating and exciting, and we're doing some exploration on this topic within our innovation lab here at Infuse, is the idea of using AI as almost like a personal assistant, right? A trusted advisor. So I'm a big Marvel Universe guy. So if anyone has seen Iron Man, you're familiar with the concept of Tony Stark using Jarvis, who's kind of like he runs his companies. It's his go-to guy. It's the guy who's connected to everything he does. And I truly believe that in the next couple of years, you're going to see us get closer and closer to that kind of reality. The fact of the matter is, we have natural language processing. We have the ability to integrate data from different sources. We have AI to kind of sift through and do predictive analytics. So it's not quite as far away as we think. And I'm personally excited to kind of see what's going to happen in that space.
Oh yeah, man, I'm gonna have to go see that movie now, because I need to know. I need to know all about this. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Phil, for coming on the podcast today. It's always so refreshing to get to chat with you, because I know you're so passionate and you get so excited talking about technology and innovation in the future. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and hopefully you'll come back on again.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me.